Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to the third edition of the Budapest Global Dialogue, co-organized by the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and the Observer Research Foundation. Over the years, this forum in the heart of Europe has grown into a truly global platform, bringing together decision makers, scholars, and other experts from across regions and disciplines. Since 2024, we're proud to have welcomed more than 100 international speakers and guests from 84 countries. This year's theme, Back from the Brink, reflects the precarious times we find ourselves in, as more and more cracks appear in the old world order. We've brought together a remarkable group of people, all of you, to think collectively about where we're heading and how we can navigate this moment to build a more resilient future. Now, to formally open this year's dialogue, please welcome first Gladden Pappin, President of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, to the stage.
Good evening, distinguished ambassadors, Madam Undersecretary, Director Orbán, esteemed former ministers, friends and colleagues from across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Back from the brink, that's the theme of tonight's third installment of the Budapest Global Dialogue. We picked that theme shortly before making the announcement in October of last year. Shortly thereafter, it was announced that the American and Russian presidents had agreed, in principle, to hold a peace summit in Budapest at the conclusion of the war. For nearly 4 years, Hungary has stood against the European mainstream on the war, for a peace settlement as quickly as possible, against mortgaging the future through blank checks and unclear plans. For nearly 4 years, Hungary has begged that we come back from the brink. The brink of what? Well, I promise that it's a coincidence that the New START treaty expired on Friday, but as you know, there are few coincidences in international affairs, although I'll have another one to mention shortly. But we knew where things were going. The intervening months have seen Operation Absolute Resolve. They've seen new tensions within the far North Atlantic zone of the transatlantic alliance, and uncertainty over the next steps in the Middle East. We've also seen the parties to the war in the neighborhood all sit down together in Abu Dhabi. We've seen rapid moves in precious metals call into question the existing monetary order. We've also seen the explosive rise of agentic AI and autonomous agents, none of whom were involved in the writing of this speech. And it's no coincidence that officials from Hungary, the United States, the Western Balkans, and the South Caucasus, as well as our colleagues in the diplomatic corps, are now considering the perspective on European and world affairs that is emerging here. At the Budapest Global Dialogue, we don't tiptoe around the key changes in the world order. In Central Europe, there's little room for error. Everything is always on the line, and that's why there's so much clarity. So let's talk about what back from the brink doesn't mean, though. It doesn't mean returning to the same set of institutions and the same set of assumptions that preceded it. That was already tried by many global actors during the period of 2020 to 2024. In their view, there had been a disruptive challenge to the status quo from 2016 to 2020. But that was an exception, according to them. The trouble is, it was right when the rules-based international order came back into force that the first major war in Europe broke out in 2022. Everyone is beginning to recognize that this time it's different. What are they recognizing? They're recognizing that the old rules didn't enforce themselves, but were backed by power. And they're recognizing that the old ideas, however noble their intention, were connected with policy mistakes that undermined that power. A no-borders vision led to a world of weaponized migration. A A no-limits view of morality helped collapse the family. A doesn't matter approach to industrial production led to severe strategic weaknesses. The main challenge is that, particularly in Europe and the United States, the intellectual architecture was built entirely around the preceding consensus. Elite American institutions, I can unfortunately report, spent decades producing an intellectually uniform product. Peace is the rules-based international order, outside of which there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. This has begun to shift, but with halting efforts, such as Mark Carney's attempt to admit that the liberal international order was the emperor who had no clothes. In this context, it's too easy just to blame the disruptors. During periods of intense change, all the partisans of the old order are against the change, and the beneficiaries or principal actors of the new orders are still skeptical and doubtful. But the real disruptors aren't just the principal agents of global change that any of us could name. They're also the cracks in the foundation of the old order itself, the overweighted and too heavy ideology that collapsed as soon as the foundations wore away. The economic, the social, military, cultural, religious, and intellectual weakness that many Western countries are struggling to address. That is the crack in the foundation. We often hear about a new world order defined by multipolarity or increasing global power, great power competition, and the collapse of the liberal rules-based order. Aside from descriptors such as post-liberal or post-American, like post-Cold War back in the day, fundamental questions are still going unanswered. What will replace the so-called rules-based international order intellectually and institutionally? How can small and middle powers in Europe navigate an era of great power competition? Do European leaders need to have a different understanding of national security or develop a more mature understanding of national security? As certain rising powers increasingly define themselves as distinct civilizations, how will the other global players respond? It was in this context that, together with Samir Saran and the Observer Research Foundation, we created the Budapest Global Dialogue to look squarely at what's materializing: a new global security architecture, renewal of the global economy, technological competition as a new arms race, and tonight's theme, the crisis of values. What brink do we want to come back from? Not just the threat of war, also the reality of civilizational erasure, back from being one mistake away from economic collapse, back from hyper-fragile and back to reality. So thank you for spending your evening tonight and tomorrow with us, and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pappin. We'll now hear from Samir Saran, president of the Observer Research Foundation.
I was going to actually start by mentioning the fundamental reason why ORF is partnering with the Hungarian Institute, and that's Balázs Orbán. So let me first recognize Balázs Orbán and his curatorial role in bringing us together, bringing India into Hungary, and for me to realize that everything I stand for, family values, melodrama, God, good food, and lots of politics, is what Hungary also thrives on. So in some sense, very far away, India finds home here. And I think that's something that's truly remarkable for me, that working with the Hungarian Institute is like working with another ORF chapter or vice versa. So thank you, Balázs, for bringing us together, and thank you, Gladden, for this partnership. I want to just make 3 points. All of us in the last year or so have been implicated by 3 words. Conflict over territory, and I think territory is big, territory is important, sovereignty is important, and all of us are, in many ways, learning how to rekindle, reimagine our relationship with this idea of being sovereigns, of belonging to land, and of engaging with what it really implies. I think we are rediscovering our relationship to the patch of real estate we were born to. And I think that's something really fascinating, that in the 21st century, we are having 2,000-year-old debates again. And it's important because I think we had strayed. The cloud had overwhelmed us. We were an IP address, and we were no longer a PIN code. And I think we are now finding a new balance between the PIN code and the IP address, between the land societies and the cloud communities. And somewhere in the middle lies the reality that we all seek. And I think that's one debate that all of us have been implicated by, the territory that is so important for sovereignty and for who we are. And I think that's the first point. The second, of course, is tariff. And you can't avoid the word tariff. And thank you to President Trump for making us all aware of the word tariff, because in some sense, it is an implication of the arrangement, economic arrangement itself, that had allowed for certain what I would call unsustainable practices. Now, you could believe in sustainability in many ways, from climate sustainability to economic sustainability to efficiency, and you could pick your own devil, and you could pick your own fetish, and you would come to the conclusion that what we were experiencing in the last 70 years was not efficient trade. And that is the reality. And in some ways, there were hidden costs that were attached and paid for by someone else that was allowing certain communities to, in many ways, have existences and models that were unsustainable. And in many ways, what we are really doing is resetting the economic compass and are finding new ways of doing business again. Of course, there are going to be new winners and losers, but I think those who are agile and entrepreneurial are likely to do well, as in any instance when there is a big disruption. And we are watching that reset happening in the last 1.5 years. And if you have the chops, you're going to take the chances, and you're going to probably make the gains. So I think the second word is tariff. So territory and tariff. And finally, of course, technology. We are at the cusp of something dramatically different, and I think AI is just the tip of the iceberg, with quantum and with Edge AI, that when it eventually dawns upon us, is going to change the human society and its reason of existence itself. And in some sense, technology is going to change politics and families and our communities like never before. And again, it's something that we need to start discussing now, because we don't want to be in a situation where it's impossible to turn back the clock and move back into a different state. So that those conversations are important again. So I think in some ways, the back from the brink is actually not really coming back from the brink, but actually not getting to that place. And I think tariffs, territory, and technology, the three big words, are in many ways the cliffs that we need to be wary of as we navigate the new world that we seek to create. In India, in the last 8 months, since I was last here in June, Gladden, we've signed an FTA with the European Union, as someone says, the mother of all deals. But let me tell you that the largest gains to that trade agreement were made when Hungary was the presidency of the EU. So thank you, Balázs and team. We made the biggest gains to get to this FTA during your presidency. We have just finalized a wonderful trade arrangement with the US, I think less than a few days ago. And we are lucky to have the best ambassador in the business, Ambassador Gord in Delhi. White House's finest is now the American flag bearer in our city. And someone told me, how do you get the best ambassador in India? And I told them, because we paid the highest tariffs for a very long time. When you pay high tariffs, you get the best person. So in some sense, we've just concluded a very important trade arrangement with the US. And then, of course, we have a bunch of deals that we have signed, from New Zealand to Oman. And of course, now we are working with the GCC and Canada and many others. But what I'm really saying is that in each of these, fundamentally, sovereignty, a new economic argument and arrangement, And of course, the overhang of technology and how it's going to affect all of it is really, really going to be the central piece and central architecture. To discuss these three words and much more, I'm glad you're all here with us this evening at the Budapest Global Dialogue. Let's not get to the brink. Let's have good conversations before that. And thank you, Gladden, and thank you, Balázs, for hosting us. So thank you for joining us this evening.
With that, we now turn to our opening panel discussion titled Restoring Civilizational Self-Confidence, Which Values Will Secure Our Future? This session will look at the increasingly fragmented state of our societies and the role that values can play. The session will be moderated by Gladden Pappin, president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, who you heard from just a few moments ago. And our distinguished panelists include Balázs Orbán, political director to the Prime Minister of Hungary, Sarah B. Rogers, Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy at the US Department of State, Sohrab Ahmari, the US editor of UnHerd, and Paul Coleman, Executive Director of ADF International. Please give our speakers a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this opening conversation. This is a conversation about values. And as I was thinking about that topic, I was considering how much debate there has been in Europe and throughout the world on values in the last few years. And that is a change, because at one time, particularly in Europe, there was only one set of acceptable values that you could talk about. And so there's been a considerable, I think, maybe restriction around the debate about values. And this brought me back to a moment 3 years ago. I thought of this, I realized this today, that 3 years ago today was the date that Samantha Power, then the administrator of the US Agency for International Development, landed in Budapest. And her visit was February 9th and 10th of 2023. And suffice it to say, a lot has changed in the US-Hungarian relationship, but the message that she brought was also very much tied up with this question. USAID announced $20 million of grants to independent civil society organizations with, suffice it to say, complex political activities. And so I wanted to start by asking Undersecretary Rogers, what has changed in the last 3 years? What is your mission in Europe? What are you seeing in Europe? What are you seeing in Hungary? And how does the value of free speech fit into that? Since you've been very active on that front.
Well, thank you very much, Gladden. So, like Samantha Power, I am appointed by the US government to exercise the statutory and occasionally the grant-making authority of the US government. And like Samantha Power, I am concerned about democratic resilience and democratic backsliding. We have seen governments postpone and cancel elections. Just hours ago, we saw one government's Ministry of Justice order that court records archives be purged amidst a controversy about grooming gangs. We have seen governments inveigh about outlawing their political opposition, and we have seen novel expedient lawfare contrived against opposition candidates to keep them out of power. One of those opposition candidates, of course, was President Trump, and that lawfare failed, and elections have consequences, and that's why I'm here, and Samantha Power's not. And I'm thrilled to be here because I think we've also seen some really auspicious developments on the international stage, including in the areas of free speech and democratic resilience. We saw a communist dictator bloodlessly removed from Venezuela, thanks to our President of Peace. We saw the United States stand with protesters in Iran who we didn't astroturf, by the way. We helped them with internet access, but that movement was completely organic. And the United States government, via me, but not only me, has been engaging aggressively on the issue of free speech, because you don't have self-governance without freedom of speech. You can't have democratic deliberation if viewpoints are proscribed from the public square. And this is something that I've believed in my entire career. It was the focus of my career as a litigator, particularly with the First Amendment work that I did before I was appointed. And it is an honor and a privilege to advance those values on behalf of the US government now, including in Europe. And if you read our national security strategy with its focus on civilizational self-confidence, the bottom line in Europe is that the point of American foreign policy is to make America safe, strong, and prosperous. And that means we want safe, strong, prosperous allies who can stand with us, who can defend themselves, and who can elect leaders that represent the genuine outcome of a fair, open, free, democratic process. Samantha Power used to say things like that, and I believe these things.
Balázs, you have had a front row seat to many of these same questions in European policy over the last few years. You've seen the contest over values, you've seen the notion of free speech and democratic backsliding regularly deployed in the European political discourse. What, from a Hungarian perspective, how do you see the importance of free speech, and in particular the question of what values will secure a strong European future?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the nice words, Samir. And honestly, I see rather a life and death fight, because there is a big gap right now on the European continent. That was the case on the American continent a couple of years ago. But right now there is a big gap on the European continent between the elites and the ordinary people. And what the ordinary people want is completely different what the European elites want. And they put enormous political, legal, and different kind of pressure on all the political forces, on all the social groups, on all the media platforms who are trying to represent the view of the majority of the ordinary European citizens. And since we are living in a democratic society, since we have democracy everywhere in the European Union, it's a serious problem. And I don't see it as a problem of freedom of speech. That's part of it. I see it as a problem of democracy. So now what is going on, we have an unelected transnational European body which has enormous regulatory power, which is backed by the local elites who are actually having the most unpopular politicians of all time in Europe. Just think about the popularity rate of leaders of United Kingdom, France, Germany, or some other big countries. And they are doing everything what they can to silence those who are fighting for the representation of the people. And this is something which is not sustainable. And this is something which is, I think it shouldn't be tolerated on the European level. So from our point of view, from the Hungarian point of view, when Samantha Power landed 3 years ago in Hungary, she was a representative of the transnational liberal elites, because she brought money and gave it to those organizations, media organizations, think tanks, and politicians who were ready to represent the view of the transnational liberal elite, even against the will of the people. And this is what I think is not acceptable. From a country's sovereignty point of view, this is definitely not acceptable. So a future of the country should be decided by the people of that country, not by money, and especially not by foreign money. So I think what changed now is that we have an American administration which is taking democracy and the will of the people seriously. And what they are doing now is they're coming as friends, and they are not willing to use their money to go against the will of the people, but to support, to let the people speak. And this is a completely different issue. And what we are trying to do in Hungary and what we are trying to do in Europe is actually the same. And we get our punishment from Brussels. As you all know, we have to pay every day 1 million euro because we not let the migrants in. They are withholding our EU money because we do not sign up for their gender propaganda. And what is going on, there is a clear and present election interference from Brussels and from Kiev because we are not backing their war plans. In Hungary, 80% of the society is against illegal migration. In Hungary, 80% of the society is against gender propaganda. And in Hungary, 80% of the society is against the war and against the further financial backing of the war which is going on in Ukraine. So when they are doing this interference, they are acting against 80% of the society's will. And this is something which is I think, also unacceptable. What we can do, luckily, we are lucky enough to have elections in just 62 days' time, and I think the proper answer will be a democratic answer. So we have to create a majority, we have to create an election victory, and then we can prove to Brussels and prove to the liberal elites that this is not something, this kind of oppression of freedom or oppression of democracy is not something which is tolerated by the Hungarian people. And I think this is the best response.
Paul, in your work, you have been active, I think, pretty much all over the world in defending free speech cases and freedom of religion and basically looking at these topics as they come up all over the world. I think everyone senses that in particular the concepts behind freedom and liberty and even liberalism at some point changed from their original meaning and became more forceful and even conformist. I don't know if that's something you're seeing. Is it something that you've seen? How did it happen, and what have you learned from looking at that?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's big questions. So I think that these values like freedom, we hear our politicians talk about these words all of the time. So in the UK context, our government talks about British values. Freedom is one of them. In the EU, the European Union is constantly talking about European values. And I think that our elites have come to imagine that these values are just freestanding concepts that can just be asserted. They are just sort of floating in the air. Everyone agrees. They're tethered to nothing. And so I think what has happened over the past few years is that these values that sound nice, that sound good, have become completely disconnected from any root, from any foundation. And they're just being asserted as buzzwords by those in power. Freedom would be an example of one of these words that's been twisted and contorted against its original meaning. Another, probably the word that is used most in terms of values today, is equality. Well, what does equality mean as a value, as a phrase, as a term? On this continent and across Western civilization for millennia, we understood the idea of equality as being something grounded in the Imago Dei, that we are made in the image of God. It was that foundation that gave us an understanding of the word equality and what it means. And however imperfectly we practice that over the centuries, we at least were able to connect the value of equality to something foundational. By cutting off these values from their foundation today, we run the risk of just using these terms to advance whatever position we want for those in power. So today, equality means men, rapists, in women's prisons. Equality means men beating women in women's sports. It means grown men in girls' bathrooms. All of these things have happened in the last decade under the guise of equality, which is just one example of many that shows that this crisis of values has really come by disconnecting all of this terminology from its original foundation. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali said it best when she said that Western civilization is like a cut flower. So if you imagine a flower looks beautiful when it's in the ground, it's connected to its life source, its root, but you cut that flower, you put it in a vase, it still looks nice for a while, but eventually, disconnected from its source, it will die. And I think that's what we are seeing play out in real time today. Our values have been cut off from their life source, and we're seeing the slow death of what's happening on our continent across Western civilization as a result.
Sohrab, you've been giving a lot of thought in your recent work to the nature of American democracy in particular, and European and Western democracy in general. A lot of people, when they write about this question, the question of values, point out that there's a much more polarized feeling in Western democracies. People somehow no longer feel like they're referring to the same country when different sets of people talk about it. And as I think you've pointed out, this marks a kind of difference from earlier stages of Western history where, well, maybe there's a more democratic take on equality and a more Republican take on equality or on liberty or on any value. But it seems that this center is being lost. So what's happening? Why did it happen? And how are you thinking about it? Like how can that sense of a shared space be restored, some type of foundation?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to share this distinguished panel. Look, I come to you as in a way as an exile or a refugee or a penitent former spokesman for the old consensus. I used to be a Wall Street Journal editorial writer, and our worldview wasn't all that different. The kind of pre-Trump right wasn't all that different from Samantha Power's worldview. About a decade ago, maybe a little bit less than that, something clicked for me where that was not working. And it touches to your question, which is, you might walk out of a meeting at Freedom House or the National Endowment for Democracy, and you're talking about, minority rights in Kazakhstan, and then you step out into Washington, D.C., and it's a Washington, D.C. where there's, lots of homeless people on the streets, where the public spaces smell like drugs, like they smell like weed, and 100,000 Americans a year are dying as a result of opioids, and a little bit later, the scourge of fentanyl. And I think a lot of Americans have come, and I would say probably Europeans as well, although I can speak to the American experience, to look at that and say, there's something not normal about that. First of all, there's something odd about talking about, concerns in Kazakhstan when your neighbors nearby are suffering from fentanyl, from drugs, from addiction, from broken families. But beyond that, I think we're seeing a return on both sides of the Atlantic to this idea of normality. I am writing a book about normal. I hope you'll preview it. You'll buy it on Amazon. And I won't bore you with the technicalities of where we got the word normal, although I think they're really fascinating. The short answer is it's not an ancient word. It's not like justice or good. Every language has some version of that stretches back millennia. Normal is a 19th century kind of scientistic word. It's a word that is born of statistics. But when ordinary people use normal, they still refer to these ancient moral intuitions of, a normal person has a sense of piety. They practice religion. A normal person is domestic. They form families natural families for the purpose of having children. And they're political. They act in a political community. And in every way, the old consensus traduced normality. Obviously, in many ways restricted religious practice, as Paul will tell you better than I can, even as it itself enshrined a kind of religion, a secular religion. The family came under immense pressure, both as a result of economic issues, people not being able to form families, but also the ideological pressures of gender ideology. And the one that I really care about these days, political community, became impossible as a result of this idea that basically everyone belongs in the West. Everyone is in the whole world is a potential citizen of the West. You can't form a polity under conditions of potentially infinity migration. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have immigration, et cetera. That's a different question. But that model of open borders makes a polity impossible. I will be accused of having a Fox News caricature of Europe for saying this, but there are certain neighborhoods you go in parts of Western and Northern Europe where you think, what is the basis of this polity other than the fact that, well, we live here and there's police and there's rules, but like, is there a deep foundation between these people, or are they just living in a kind of hostility? And is that really a political community in which I can act? Even as an immigrant myself to the West, I voted with my feet to come to the West, not to a kind of multicultural bazaar. So all of these have been under immense pressure. But normal has a way of reasserting itself. It's like the repressed. It doesn't stay repressed long. And so I think we are seeing, on both sides of the Atlantic, through mainly democratic channels, a reassertion of the normal, and that's a healthy and good thing. And there are things that the right can do to guide that, and I think if the left is sane, it will give in more. I'm shocked to the extent that in the US on the immigration question, the left seems to be reverting back to its former kind of Biden-era status quo ante. It's, even whatever you might think of this or that immigration enforcement tactic, the American people are not ready to go back to, potentially infinity migration. So eager to unpack that with all of you. Thank you.
Sarah, I think we've all heard many different accounts of what censorship is over the years. I mean, I think of George Orwell, 1984. You imagine a kind of oppressive and obvious apparatus that's like explicitly, shutting things down. What's the reality? Like you're basically tackling this area now. What's the reality? How is it working? And give us some examples in that area.
So I think one distinction depends on whether your regime arrived at its censorship apparatus honestly and directly, or sort of dishonestly in kind of a boiling frog decline. So the sort of regime that decides out of the gate that it's going to censor, like the GDR or the CCP, will outright prescribe certain speech, will build great firewalls to cut off the internet, and will shoot protesters for holding up the wrong signs. And we all know those regimes, and America has articulated clear policies on that kind of thing. But the sort of insidious, sometimes soft, sometimes indirect, but ultimately quite encompassing censorship that we've seen in the West is different. Often there's a tendency to diffuse and disguise responsibility to avoid political accountability. So for example, the structure of the EU Digital Services Act is that the responsibility of flagging content to be suppressed is outsourced to these NGOs, which are funded directly or indirectly by the government, and then laundered through platforms that are under direct and indirect political pressure to comply. And then there's ultimately no public docket of what exact content was flagged and why, and it's this kind of opaque morass. You saw during the Biden administration an attempt to construct basically a de facto DSA regime in the United States. And this was exposed in some of the discovery in a case called Murphy that went to our Supreme Court, where you had these non-governmental organizations funded, sadly, by people like me in positions like mine that would work arm in arm with the government to identify viewpoints for suppression. And one of the logics underlying this apparatus, and it still amazes me, is that authorities which had been delegated to secure the critical infrastructure of the United States, so for example, to secure our power grid against Chinese cyber attacks, were distended so that the infrastructure of the United States encompassed the cognitive infrastructure, meaning the government's job isn't to protect the power grid from intrusion, but to protect your brain from intrusion by so-called adversarial narratives. I represented Charlie Kirk legally before he died. Charlie Kirk was on a list of top 10 censorship targets maintained by one of these NGOs. I knew Charlie, and I can tell you, Charlie was not a Russian bot or an agent of a foreign power. He was 100% American and wanted the best for America. UnHerd, which is Sohrab's website, was also the target of this complex and opaque censorship apparatus. And I kind of insouciantly at the outset of this panel compared myself to Samantha Power because it's true that we exercise some analogous statutory authorities. One way my office is going to operate differently is we're going to be very forthright and transparent about everything we do. And that's why it is no surprise I've made clear in almost all of my public engagements that I want to promote free speech in Western allied democracies, and that's what my grant making is going to be doing.
So I want to ask a follow-up for the benefit of the audience, because this is not something that I understand clearly myself. So in the DSA setup, if I log on to Facebook or social media in Europe, then it's actually a constellation of NGOs which are semi-informing the picture of public space that I'm seeing?
So there's both direct and indirect. The DSA, it may shock you to learn, is a sprawling statute supported by an intricate bureaucracy.
We're familiar.
Quite anomalous in Europe, I know. So some of the DSA content censorship is performed, basically member states have to appoint what are called trusted flaggers, and these are organizations, they might have names like the Center for Digital Integrity or the Center for Countering Hate, and it's their job to scroll Twitter or Facebook and look for things that offend their sensibilities and report them to the platforms. And then the platform is required to allocate to the trusted flagger a sort of priority action channel. We saw the Biden administration attempt to create the same structure in the United States, where if one of these deputized, anointed NGOs reported Charlie Kirk's tweet, I won't name individual Twitter executives because that's very in the weeds, but they would act on those at a higher priority because it was coming from the government. So that's one channel under the DSA, and I think an interesting critique of it would be that if the government admitted, like if you just had a list of tweets that the government says were not allowed to exist, like no, you're not allowed to say this about the grooming gangs in Britain, for example, and I, the British government, am telling you you can't say it, there might be more democratic transparency and accountability. Just like President Xi saying you're not allowed to tweet a picture of Winnie the Pooh, right? But you don't have that. You have this opacity and this diffusion of responsibility. That said, the DSA, and not just the DSA, but other European censorship laws have direct censorship mechanisms too. So under Article 34 of the DSA, designated platforms, coincidentally or not, almost all of these platforms are American, have to do this elaborate risk assessment architecture where they take into account, for example, the risk of hate speech or disinformation on their platforms. And obviously, unlike some American statutes, the DSA does not give safe harbor for compliance if you check discrete boxes, but it kind of hints that if you follow all these voluntary codes of practice and you have adequate risk assessments for all these things, then maybe the massive fines are less likely. And so there are all these pressures exerted to choke off speech. And I don't think every single European policymaker who votes for these kinds of measures fully intends the full gamut of censorship that results. Maybe some of them do, but I think a lot of them are acting in earnest and in good faith in the moment, thinking, oh, sure, we want algorithm transparency and we want to suppress, hate and incitement. And these things get very vaguely defined, and the responsibility for moderating them is diffused and disguised. And the NGOs in the ecosystem that do the work are very ideologically slanted, and this is the result that you get. UnHerd.com gets demonetized, basically.
Paul, did you want to weigh in on that one too, or on the censorship question, I think?
Well, that was a great explanation. And I think just to maybe join together with what Sohrab said in terms of this return to normal and when you were saying it, Sohrab, I was thinking, if you imagine that normal is like a balloon that you blow up and then it's like underwater, that balloon wants to come out again. It wants to bubble up to the surface. And what we're seeing with the censorship apparatus across Europe now and around the Western world is a forcibly pushing that down and preventing it from happening. And so all of this architecture is designed essentially to stop that from bursting out. And it is brazen in some areas, and we see this particularly, I think, in the UK context and in Germany, where the officials are just openly admitting to dawn raids, arresting people in the middle of the night. But the challenge in the digital age, as was outlined, is just how complex this whole area is, which makes us almost unable to understand what's happening to us. You can't see the speech that you never received, and so you don't really know what's happening. But essentially, the desire from our elites to have narrative control through the mechanism of content moderation and countering vague and undefined terms like hate speech and misinformation, disinformation, is preventing the people from being able to say what they want to say and vote the way that they want to vote. And eventually, it will blow up. I mean, you can't suppress it forever. It will blow up. And the longer they force it down, I think the worse it's going to be.
Balázs, building on the last couple of comments here, are we getting closer to that kind of backlash in Europe? I'm thinking of something that Sarah said, which is that many people, many officials, even when they passed these regulations, maybe didn't think about the consequences. And as you think about the development of Europe in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, it seems that many things have happened in Europe that nobody voted for and that nobody asked for, and that maybe even did anyone vote for higher energy prices? I don't know. Probably not, because no one would. So what happened there? And is the bubble getting closer to coming back to the surface, as it were? Now I'm stealing Paul's metaphor, but basically, is Europe in this? Did Europe choose to get where it is?
Well, are we closer to the backlash? It depends on whether we are going to be successful or not on a leadership change on the European level. Because right now, as it was mentioned by the distinguished panelists, these decisions and these regulations are not came from nowhere. They were decisions of the Brusselian bureaucrats and the transnational institutions. So these are the laws which were made by them. And so the reality is that we need, and actually these are operating as political tools to maintain their political power. This is how they could gain control, and this is how they want to keep control and keep power. This is how they want to manipulate the democratic will of the people. So I think we have one chance, one opportunity. We have to have a new leadership on the Brusselian level. And with the new leadership, with the with a renewed democratic mandate, they can have new regulations. Otherwise, it's not going to work. As many of you know me, I'm a guy who doesn't want to save the world. I just want to save my own country, Hungary. I'm a hyper-realist person, and this question only bothers me from the sovereignty point of view. So, because according to the statistics, an average citizen spends almost 2 hours on a social media platform. In Hungary, the most popular one is Facebook, and according to all the statistics, 5% of the content which was showed him or her on his or her feed is political. So if you spend 2 hours on Facebook, it could mean that you meet with 20 or 30 political contents on your feed. And as it was mentioned by Paul, who is the one who decides what happened today and what can you see as a content on your feed? And based on that, what you decide what is important for your country, and based on that, how you decide what is the political environment around you. And these decisions nowadays are made by algorithms backed by transnational, multinational companies. And if they are biased, if they are not neutral, if they are acting in accordance with the transnational elite, then they are trying to control my country. And they are trying to take away the sovereignty of my country. And this is not acceptable. So I don't want to save the word. I don't want to tell people what values they should follow. There are some civilizations who are worship the value of freedom of speech. There are some civilizations who are worship not so much the virtue of freedom of speech, but they are great civilizations, all of them. From me, it's a sovereignty question. Now, big multinational companies are deciding the political environment and the political landscape of my country, what the citizens of this country see, and what they find out as what is happening in their country. And so, for this reason, I think in the upcoming decades, all the serious nations has to create a method or an idea or a way to have pushback and to create a situation where these platforms, if they want to operate, because we Hungarians, we are just a country of 10 million living in Hungary. Hungarian language is spoken worldwide by, let's say, 30 million people. So we Hungarians, we will not be able to create a social media platform for these 30 million people based on the Hungarian languages. But we will, and we can cooperate with all the big international social media platforms if they create a level playing field, if they are neutral, and if they let the democracy thrive. And I think on the European level and on the national level, if we take ourselves seriously, this is a project which we should succeed with in the upcoming 10 years. And that's why I'm extremely grateful to have Paul and his institution. Like we have real think tankers, real NGOs who are not willing to interfere based on their political views, but they want to create level playing field. And finally, we have from the United States side an administration which is telling the same. Politics shouldn't be decided by our algorithm and our politically motivated ideologues, but it should be decided by the people. And based on that principle, we will be able to work together, and we will create a Western environment, political environment, which is sustainable for all of us. That's what I'm hoping for.
If I could continue with you for just a moment. It seems like every 6 months or so, mainstream European leaders refer to some event and say, well, that was a major wake-up call. Like, now we need to focus. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, well, that was a wake-up call. Now we need to think about what's really important for Europe. But in the last year, I'm shifting in a slightly more practical direction, but in the last year, the Trump administration has kind of put forward a lot of challenges to Europe. From a Hungarian perspective, how do you see those challenges, and are they happening on the level of values? I think it's been said, well, until now we shared values between the United States and Europe, and I think when this term was used, it was tilted in maybe more of a progressive direction. And Trump has been challenging that, and so the response from the European side is, well, Trump rejects values. America is rejecting values as such. But I think what's been emerging on the panel is something a little bit different, and so I was wondering how you saw that, if you want to address it.
Well, I see it in a very simple way. So Trump and the American administration now is trying to help Europe, but Europe is rejecting this help because the most important priority of the new administration is peace. How to close the Ukraine-Russian conflict, which is a vital interest for Europe as well. My question is why the Brazilian elite is playing against the Trump administration efforts. There is a secret shadow alliance between Kiev and Kiev leadership and Brussels leadership, because they think that their political survival is relying on the continuation of the current war policy, what was formulated by the Biden administration. So they want to keep funding and keep fueling and keep financing the war, because that's the only reason how they can preserve power. Because if peace comes, they have to answer to their own people why we were in a war for like 4 years. We were spending a lot of money, many people were dying, and we received nothing. We lost the war. They would have faced the political consequences, and they want to avoid that. And it's not a coincidence that all the censorship issues are coming right now. The European elites now saying that it's a security issue to get prepared for the war. And if there is a war preparation project going on, you can't have counter-argumentation. You either sign up or we will shut you down. And this is the reason why all the anti-war voices are shut it down in Europe, because the elite wants to preserve the pro-war narrative behind their initiatives. So I think when President Trump and the Americans are saying in a very transparent and understandable way that it should be all of us interest to close the war, to stop our borders, or to stop illegal migration on our borders, and to preserve democracy, let the people speak, this should be a vital European interest. And the way how hostile the European response is a proof that that something is wrong on the European continent. So what is the plan? Our plan is that we are going to win the elections this April, and we have to politically destroy the European liberal leadership by the year of 2029. Because if we don't do that, I'm pretty much convinced that they will try to drag all of us into a full-scale war, which would have a devastating consequence on the European continent. So we are the opponents of the Brussels elite, and we have all of our chances to push them out from the political leadership. It just requires strength, stamina, and dedicated effort.
Sohrab, you've spent your adult professional life inside of elite journalistic institutions in the US, so you know how elites think, you know how they talk about values, and similar, I think, to the way that the European elites do. Is that changing at all? Like a few years ago, basically a kind of woke liberal progressivism was totally dominant in the American elite. That is values. To not embrace that is to fail to have values, is to be bad. But there's been a kind of backlash. Sometimes it's not clear how far it goes. Is there a change in the elite? Is there a change possible in the elite? And what should they be learning from an alternative perspective about the values that are really necessary to restore a more normal and a more normal society that everyone can invest in?
Yeah, that's a complicated question to answer, but I think in some measurable ways, there's a reasonable case to be made that what was called woke began to rise maybe in the mid-2010s and had its peak in 2020 and really had become passé by 2022, by the mid to late Biden era. There are measures, like when I say that, the use of really charged ideological phrases like systemic racism in the New York Times. You can measure that and it went down. Other signs of that kind. But when I talk to, I would say, the center-left elites, I still find that they will not have a coherent account for why those ideas that they championed were bad, but rather they just think, well, we're not going to talk about them, or we're going to talk about them in a different way. And you hear that, for example, they know, for example, that Paul mentioned it, that biological men competing in women's sports is really unpopular. It's like a 70-30 or 80-20 issue against it. So I think what you hear often is basically saying, well, we're just not going to talk about that. But are they going to say, hey, like, that was bad because there's such a thing as a fundamental difference between men and women, and they have different bodies and so on? No, I think they're not going to have a reckoning. So I think there's a chance that those ideas in a different context, maybe it's already happening, will make a comeback. Likewise, with immigration, you often hear them say, well, yes, we have to have control over the border. But what they mean often is, we need to have an orderly way by which millions of people can come into the country, rather than people just don't want so much immigration. So it's a mixed picture. Well, what I would just say is a message I've shared in various forms since roughly 2016-17 is, again, it jibes with what Paul said, which is, if you don't want really scary populisms, if you're a center-right, mainstream center-right or center-left leaders, if you don't want the really scary versions, you should concede a little bit to this model of creating cordons sanitaires, whether it's at the international level around a country like Hungary, or whether it's within the national politics, using coalitional blocking to prevent the party that just want the largest plurality of votes from actually getting to govern. These kinds of tactics, at some point, as life becomes more miserable for ordinary people, or as it challenges their sense of what's normal, they will recoil from them, and then the cordon sanitaire will not hold anymore. And I think that's when you're at risk of getting the worst versions of the right. So I think it's this sense of getting the center elites, the mainstream elites, if they have any sense of maybe even political self-preservation, to be modest, to be willing to be a little bit humble and grant more, rather than think they can use administrative means, underhanded tech censorship, lawfare, etc., to try to contain the popular vote, which is still, I think, the intuition that a lot of them have, at least certainly judging by the Starmer government in various ways.
Sarah, I want to come back to the question of the civilizational alliance between the United States and Europe, because I think we've also been dancing around that in a number of questions. How do you see that question? The Trump administration has talked a lot about it, particularly with the publication of the National Security Strategy. What is necessary to keep a shared civilization, or what are the threats to it?
So, one way to revive civilizational self-confidence as expressed in European policy, and the number one way to shore up the shared civilizational roots of the United States and Europe, is to permit genuine democracy in some of these countries, because we've talked about the Trump administration in Europe being at odds on some of these policy issues, on mass migration, on online censorship, on sovereignty, on the family. But the truth is, the Trump administration is sometimes at odds with Brussels on those topics. But if you look at the polls in these European countries, we're not at odds with the plurality or majority of Europeans. That's why the people controlling the censorship levers are so scared of permitting dissent. So I think if you let democratic, Republican, Western self-governance work as advertised and intended, you'll see kind of a restored equilibrium. And I think I've seen polemicists posit that some of these elites, they have this like libidinal masochistic urge to be dispossessed or overcome. Like what else could explain these policy choices on migration particularly? And I don't think it's that, but I do think that there is this sort of penitential ideology where you rewrite your own history as one of disgrace and you see your good life as representing some kind of ill-gotten gains that need to be redistributed through open borders or racial spoils or cathartic violence. I think that's the ideology that tears down the posters of Israeli hostages. That's the ideology that applauds and elevates kind of the most extreme anti-colonial rhetoric. That's the ideology of not the center left, but the left. And I think some policymakers have been directly and consciously or indirectly and unconsciously captured by it. And you see them literally and figuratively kneeling in kente cloth. And I don't think that's sustainable. But I also think to the extent that you see that in Brussels, you don't necessarily see it among the European people. To the extent that you saw it in DC, you didn't end up seeing it among the American people. And I agree with Sohrab that what we called wokeness sort of hit its it really kind of started cresting in 2012, and then it hit its kind of affective fervor, its peak of that kind of frenzied expression in 2020. But the underlying impulse may still be there. It may still come back in some other form. But I think that if you just hold an election, right, like a free, fair election, and allow free, fair political speech leading up to it, you can see salutary results that might soften and appease some of this populism and might restore a government more aligned with what the citizenry wants.
You know, it wasn't that long ago that the situation online in the U.S. was quite different, where if you posted that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, then the NGO-driven algorithm would like community note you and say, fact check, women can actually be men, and vice versa. But it seems that that's changed. So what sign? Yeah, go ahead. You were about to say something.
Yeah, well, I was also going to say, like, one reason that changed, and you can run a kind of natural experiment before and after Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. You know, we had the first effective grassroots activist backlash to trans activism after Elon Musk acquired Twitter. You had the Bud Light boycott. You had a stories trend that would have been suppressed before. One reason there was such a fervent backlash to Elon Musk acquiring Twitter, organized efforts to arrange ad boycotts and so forth, was that it was anticipated, probably correctly, that this would play a role in the 2024 election. And Twitter X is just one of several platforms. Facebook is another one. You know, you saw Mark Zuckerberg come out after the election and say what the court records and the Twitter files and common sense already showed, which was that there was pressure, explicit and implicit, direct and indirect, to suppress political dissent on these platforms. And when you have the entire public square curated by a radicalized ideological sliver of the elite, you don't have a functioning democracy.
And do you see signs of hope in Europe?
I think in the same polls you see signs of hope, but I really do think that the internet censorship issue is kind of the existential choke point. Because if the censorship apparatus, the censorship class kind of gets its claws in and intimidates these companies to the extent that it aspires to, then you can distort democracy in frightening ways. And that's one reason I've made this fight such a priority for my office.
Lightning round of final comments, Paul.
Well, I completely agree with that. So I'm a free speech lawyer here in Europe, and the reason that that's what I spend my time doing is because I believe that it is so necessary for everything else that we would want to talk about, that we would want to achieve. And I think that, in my view, to piggyback on the question of hope in Europe, I think, and why Back from the Brink is such a great title, I think the next 4 years in Europe is going to determine the next century and potentially beyond. Almost every major country in Europe will have an election by 2029, including my home country of the UK. And almost every single country in Europe, the people are crying out for change. They have been voting this way and calling for this for so many years, And in the next 3 or so years, I think we're going to see, will that give out? Will the balloon, so to speak, break from the water? Or will the digital sensors win and usher in this sort of age of AI-fueled digital facial recognition surveillance dystopia? And that is the fork in the roads that I see over the next 3 years or so. And it is a battle of life and death, as Balázs said. It is all or nothing.
Just very quickly, I think we also have this opportunity to see what the populace now, insofar as they've been admitted into the halls of power, will do. I mean, there's this surreal aspect to Davos gatherings now, where it used to be that the populists were often like on the sidelines haranguing the mainstream politicians and business leaders as they went inside, and now they're the ones wearing the lanyards and kind of part of the mix. So what will they do with that? I think the caution they need to have is that, in a way, to be vigilant about their new friends in the corporate and tech world. Mark Zuckerberg didn't fundamentally, and I would say even Elon, didn't fundamentally change their worldview, right? That there's a reason why Mark Zuckerberg believed something in 2023 and then suddenly seemed to change his mind in 2024. So populists need to actually use the power they now have to hold corporate power, insofar as they can encroach upon speech, accountable as well, rather than being cheap dates. Thank you.
Well, as we see, Hungarians, the age of neoliberal world order is over. Something new is coming. Probably, as we try to describe it in Hungary, we would call it an age of nations, which means that every single nation, which is only those nations can be successful who are able to preserve and protect their own sovereignty, their way of maneuvering. They are not ideologically motivated anymore. They are hyper-realistic, hyper-nationalistic in a good way, and they are act in accordance with their own interest in the field of security, economy, energy, and so on and so on. So I think we don't have, in many ways, we don't have the answers yet. But what we see that if you want to be successful, this is the way of thinking. This is the mindset you need to adapt to. And it's not only true in the case of superpowers like US or China or India or Russia or some other superpowers, but this is even so the case with mid-powers or smaller countries. And everybody has to invent and execute a strategy which fits to these changed realities. How to preserve your sovereignty, how to preserve your way to decide your own future, and how to create a balance between big powers through which you can protect your citizens, preserve peace, and create an opportunity for economic prosperity. And honestly, I'm very grateful to have you here, and I'm very grateful to have events like this, because it shows us that Hungary and Budapest is getting to be one place of this kind of thinking. So if we can meet here every year, then things are not lost. This is why I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that concludes our opening evening. We will reconvene here tomorrow morning for another exciting day of the Budapest Global Dialogue. We'll kick off with a keynote address by Péter Szijjártó, Hungary's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. From there, the day will take us through some of the defining battlegrounds of our time, including global security, energy geopolitics, technological competition, and the future of the international economy. We'll also hear from 3 more distinguished keynote speakers. Please note that tomorrow morning, all guests will need to be seated by 8:55, so make sure you arrive on time. Now, we invite all of you to join us at the standing reception just outside these doors, where you can continue the conversation. Thanks again for joining us today, and see you back here tomorrow, bright and early.